Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's having a nice Friday evening. I know I am. Uh, and I hope everyone's having a great summer. I know I haven't made any videos in a while, but I am working on another video about some U.S. history um, with regards to the way that the states got their shapes, things like that. Let's see. One second, one second. Okay, so I'm working on a video about how a few states got their shapes and about not walking, driving across an interesting state border that exists in the US. And I think it's a pretty cool video. I think you might like it if you're interested in history and geography and stuff like that. But anyway, that's not today's topic. Today's topic is something that I find actually much more interesting than that, which is US history and physics history, and that is Oppenheimer. So, I don't know how many people here have seen the Christopher Nolan Oppenheimer movie that came out last weekend. I saw it. I thought it was an amazing movie. I'm a big Christopher Nolan fan to begin with, so that already like got me excited. But then you know, seeing that it's going to be about Oppenheimer and about physics history, I was extremely excited. And I went and watched it, and I loved the movie, and I just found the history very fascinating. So that's what I want to talk about here today. So yeah, let me see. I'm going to make sure that the audio and everything is looking good on the stream. So just give me a second. Looks pretty good to me. Um, yeah, so we are going to be talking today. We're going to be talking about Oppenheimer's security clearance hearing and how he had his security clearance revoked in 1954 uh, due to suspected ties to communism and allegations that he was spying for the Russians. So if you have watched the Oppenheimer movie, then you'll know about this obviously. And there's there's going to be spoilers in all likelihood in this stream. I always find the term spoilers funny for like historical films because it's like, well, is it really spoiled if it's all part of the public record already? But regardless, you should probably go watch the movie before you watch this stream, unless you've actually read the book that the movie's based on, called American Prometheus. I plan on reading that book now. Right at the end of the movie, it says like based on this book, American Prometheus, and I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't know that. That's cool, and so I want to read that book now. It's a biography about Oppenheimer. Um, but yeah, so yeah, let's get started here. So setting the stage a little bit. Um, Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer, he was the uh, lead physicist in charge of the Manhattan Project during World War II. He is called the father of the atomic bomb because he led this program uh, in the US to build the first atomic bomb. And that culminated in the Trinity tests, or the Trinity test in New Mexico at Los Alamos, and it all went pretty successfully, I would say. Like from a technical, scientific perspective, it's really incredible how quickly they managed to get this done and get this operational. So very very successful. And after the war, he was a very prominent figure for his work on the project. But after the war, there was almost immediately the beginnings of a nuclear arms race between the United States and Russia. Uh, and this centered around the idea of creating a larger bomb than a nuclear atomic bomb, and that is the thermonuclear bomb. And the difference between a nuclear bomb and a thermonuclear bomb is that the nuclear bombs that Oppenheimer developed during the Manhattan Project were based on nuclear fission, whereas the thermonuclear bombs of the modern day are based on nuclear fusion as well as nuclear fission. But the fusion is really the kick that gets it going. So nuclear fusion is a much more energetic process than nuclear fission. It has the capability to release a lot more energy. However, it takes quite a bit of input energy to get it going. It's a big project right now. Physicists are looking into, and scientists developing nuclear fusion as a viable energy source because we haven't been able to harness that yet. But the way that a the way that a normal nuclear fission bomb works is that you get a bunch of uranium-235 or plutonium, I forget what isotope, but you get these radioactive metals and you concentrate them into a small space, and then using a conventional explosive, you cause the well, there's two methods actually. So there's the implosion method, which is the one that's featured in the Oppenheimer movie that was using plutonium. You basically have this plutonium, which is pretty compact, but it's not compact enough yet that it's going to cause like a chain reaction and explode. So what you have to do is you trigger that reaction with conventional bombs that are precisely timed to all go off at the same time, which causes the plutonium to implode and get even more compact. And that increase in compactness means that there's going to be more neutrons firing everywhere and more fission events happening, and it's going to snowball and runaway effect and explode. The same thing happens with uranium, except it's a gun type weapon. So you have two halves, two blocks of uranium, and on their own, both of them don't have enough mass to reach the critical mass, which is where a lump of radioactive material will naturally, just on its own, once it reaches the critical mass, explode. So you're just under that critical mass, and then you fire them together, and once they're together, now you have the critical mass. So that's a fission bomb. All of this is fission. A nuclear fusion bomb starts off by doing fission, and then it uses that fission reaction to start the fusion reaction. And the difference in scale here is immense. So the original nuclear bombs, the Trinity test, the Little Boy and Fat Man dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those were in the tens of thousands of kilotons. Modern thermonuclear weapons are in the megatons, tens of megatons. So that is quite a big difference. And even during the Manhattan Project, the people in the project were recognizing this potential future possibility. I think it's Edward Teller, who I have a graphic of. Let me pull him up. Oh, wait, do I? Yeah, here we go. Okay. Edward Teller, played by Benny Safdie, he says, what if we use a fission reaction to start a fusion reaction? And this hypothetical bomb is called the Super. And during the Manhattan Project, they're like, that is too far flung because they're focusing on the easier task of making a nuclear bomb. But after the war, it becomes relevant in the nuclear arms race. And Oppenheimer has a strong opposition to the continued development of these weapons. What he wants people to do, he wants the heads of state of the US and the USSR to just sit down and agree to non-proliferation before it gets off the ground to say, look, we both have these bombs now, because after a few years after World War II, Russia developed its own bomb. They say, look, we both have nuclear bombs now. Let's stop. Let's agree to stop, not go any further, because we don't need the thermonuclear bombs. Well, today we have thermonuclear bombs, so we know how that went. But this created a lot of political enemies for Oppenheimer. Uh, and ultimately, these enemies dug into his past ties to communist groups and basically used that to accuse him of being disloyal and of selling secrets to the Russians, because this had happened. Some of the other scientists on the Manhattan Project had been spies for Russia, and there were high-profile cases where I think the Rosenbaums were like this couple who had both sold secrets to Russia. So there's a lot of this fear going around of people selling secrets to Russia, and that genuine fear made it a very potent allegation that could be weaponized against people where it shouldn't have been. And that's basically what happened to Oppenheimer. So, so ultimately what happened was in 1954, Oppenheimer's security clearance was up for renewal, but they rejected it because they said, look, you've had ties to communist groups, which we'll get into it, because what I plan to do with this stream actually is to read through these transcripts, and we'll see what sort of ties he had, and it's going to be interesting. But they basically used that to get him kicked out, to try and discredit him. So yeah. So let's take a look first at the calendar. The calendar I have up here in the top middle shows how the hearings went. There were 19 days of hearings, and these are all closed door hearings too. That's another important thing. This was not a big public spectacle. This was, I mean, if you've seen the movie, if you've seen the movie, they portray it. But yeah, so not a public spectacle. This is just people sitting down in a room. But there are a lot of big names in physics and history that ended up showing up to testify about Oppenheimer, and it's really fascinating. So there are 19 days of these hearings. They are each split up into a separate volume, and the transcripts are available online because they've been declassified. So that's very interesting, right? And I thought I would read through them. So here we're starting on the first day, Volume 1. This is Monday, April 12th, 1954. At about 10 a.m., they start the hearings. And this is basically an appeals hearing. So Oppenheimer has his security clearance revoked, and he appeals. He says, I want to have a real hearing and get my security clearance. Like, I know you denied me, but I want to appeal that decision. And so this is the hearing that results. 19 days. I haven't looked into this, but I imagine that was atypical. So this is a hearing by the Atomic Energy Commission. So anyway, Volume 1, Day 1. These are the people that are in the room. Let me pull them up. So first, we have the three members of the appointed council who are going to be judging Oppenheimer. So these three serve as the judges. Of course, they're not real judges. They love to specify that over and over again in the movie, and I imagine that might be reflected in the transcript, because this is not a formal judicial process. It's just it's kind of structured that. It's like if you go into mediation or arbitration or something at work. It's not an actual court, obviously, but sometimes they structure it like that. So yeah, so you have these three: Gordon Gray, Ward Evans, and Thomas Morgan. So then you have the prosecution. The prosecution consists of Roger Robb, played by Jason Clarke here. And on the left, interestingly, this is a portrait from when Roger Robb was later appointed to, I believe it was the uh, Washington, D.C. Circuit Court, which is interesting. So he became a very prominent judge. I will actually look him up on Wikipedia just to make sure I got that fact right. Um, yeah, senior judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Right. So he he this is actually a very important appeals court. He never got onto the Supreme Court, but historically, a lot of Supreme Court picks are people that are currently on the DC Circuit Court. That's like the talent pool that presidents often like to choose from. So it's very interesting how high up this guy got after being the prosecutor in the Oppenheimer case. So then we have just another guy, C.A. Rolander, and he's not depicted in the movie. He's just like assisting in the prosecution. And you have the same thing on the other side, on the defense side. You have Lloyd K. Garrison, who's depicted in the movie, but then you also, and he's serving as, counsel for Oppenheimer. But you also have two others, Silverman and Ecker, who are also defending him, but they're not depicted in the movie because why like split up lines between two or three characters when you can just distill them down to like the lead uh like prosecutor and defense attorney. Like it makes sense from a storytelling perspective, right? But yeah, so finally for this first hearing, then we have Oppenheimer himself. He testifies here. So this is the room on the left. You can see the bottom left. And this is taken inspiration from the movie The Shape of This Table. So you can see the counsel up at the top, the prosecution on the left, the defense on the right, and the witness, currently Oppenheimer, is down there. So yeah, let's get started on these transcripts. Okay. And if you want to follow along, shoot, I should have put the link in the chat. But if you want to follow along here, you can. I'll look it up. Atomic Energy Commission Oppenheimer transcript. Here we go. Declassified in full. Okay, Department of Energy. This link, ost.gov/opennet/hearing. So here you can see all the links to the different volumes, and let me see actually. So there's some interesting things here about like the declassification process. Because first these were released, but they were obviously classified. But then eventually they were declassified. And then you can see this update down here is that in December of 2022, the DOE secretary, the Secretary of Energy, basically said, "I'm vacating this decision." Which I always find it kind of funny when someone who's part of like a department or an agency that made the wrong choice like 50 years ago comes out and says, "I'm vacating that choice," because it's like Oppenheimer has been dead for over 50 years, so you're a little too late on that one. Um, so yeah, just had a power surge or something. But yeah, so I always find these statements comedic. So uh, they reversed it, but little cold comfort, right, for the man himself. But yeah, so this is where you can find the information, the transcripts. I am going to add it to the video description as well. And then we will get started. But yeah, how is everyone? How is everyone doing today? I hope everyone's doing great. Uh, okay. Okay, everything looks good. I think we are ready to go. So, yeah. Oh, and if you have anything that you'd like to say in the chat, please chat. I love talking to you guys. So, yeah, if there's anything that you think of that's interesting that you want me to talk about, you can ask your questions, leave comments. Feel free. I have my eye on chat. So yeah, let's go. We begin. The above entitled matter came on for hearing before the board pursuant to notice at 10 o'clock a.m. on April 12, 1954. We begin with Dr. Gray. Dr. Gray says, I should like at this time to have the reporters sworn. For the information of Dr. Oppenheimer and his counsel, the reporter is Anton Papich, Jr., the transcriber Kenneth V. Bowers. The reporter and transcriber were thereupon duly sworn by Dr. Gray. Dr. Gray, the hearing will now come to order. This board, appointed by Mr. K. D. Nichols, General Manager of the Atomic Energy Commission at the request of Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, is composed of the following members: Gordon Gray, Chairman, Ward V. Evans, and Thomas A. Morgan. All members of the board are present, and board counsel Roger Robb and C. A. Rolander, Dr. and Mrs. Oppenheimer, are present. Present also are Mr. Lloyd K. Garrison, counsel for Dr. Oppenheimer. Would you identify your association? Mr. Garrison says, Samuel J. Silverman, my partner, and Alan B. Ecker, associates of my firm. Then back to Dr. Gray. An investigation of Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer conducted under the provisions of something funny. Here's my first commentary. I didn't note down who the transcriber and the reporter were just because they don't say anything, right? That's the point. They sit there and type. But it is funny because these transcripts look to be, I mean, they're scanned, but they look very original. Like, I don't think someone has come back later and retyped them up. And looking at the original documents, it looked like the transcriber, who, has to type very fast to keep up with everything, got sick of writing Oppenheimer every single time he's mentioned. And so they've started shortening it to Oppenheim. So they got rid of the ER. So it's Oppenheim. But yeah, I'm still going to say Oppenheimer. This light bulb is like, I'm afraid my power is going to go out. I hope not. But yeah, so, okay, continuing. Dr. Gray. An investigation of Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer conducted under the provisions of Section 10B, 5B, 1 to 3 of the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 has revealed certain information which casts doubt upon the eligibility of Dr. Oppenheimer for clearance for access to restricted data as provided by the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. This information is as follows. So this is referenced in the movie, the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, basically formalizes everything and gets the nuclear program really codified into law. Because it's interesting to think about the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was literally a government conspiracy, right? Like today we think of like, oh, conspiracy theories. But a conspiracy is when a group of people get together in secret to do something that people don't know about. And that's what the Manhattan Project was. That was the point. So, of course, there was no law about nuclear weapons until after the first bomb was dropped, right? So that's what this Atomic Energy Act of 1946 did. But part of the act says, no communists in the nuclear program. We don't want it. We don't want the Russians getting any of our information. So, yeah. And basically, Oppenheimer is now running afoul of this law uh, just because of his former associations. And we're going to get into this. This was basically targeted. His political enemies were not happy with him, and so they're like, okay, what can we dredge up uh, to go after him? So this information is as follows. This is a letter addressed to Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, New Jersey, dated December 23rd, 1953, reading as follows. So this is J.D. Nichols' letter. Of course, it's Gordon Gray is the one who's actually reading this to the record, but just to show you, if you've watched the movie, so that you know who I'm talking about, Nichols is... Where is he? I have a slide for him somewhere. He's this guy. There we go. K.D. Nichols. Anyway, so I'll leave it on. I made these slides to have like who's talking, but I'm going to leave it on him. So keep in mind, it's Dr. Gray talking, but this is Nichols' letter. So, Dear Dr. Oppenheimer, Section 10 of the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 places upon the AEC the responsibility for assuring that individuals are employed by the Commission only when such employment will not endanger the common defense and security. In addition, Executive Order 10450 of April 27, 1953, requires the suspension of employment of any individual where there exists information indicating that his employment may not be clearly consistent with the interests of the national security. As a result of additional investigation as to your character, associations, and loyalty, and review of your personnel security file in the light of the requirements of the Atomic Energy Act and the requirements of Executive Order 10450, there has developed considerable question whether your continued employment on AEC work will endanger the common defense and security, and whether such continued employment is clearly consistent with the interests of the national security. This letter is to advise you of the steps which you may take to assist in the resolution of this question. The substance of the information which raises the question concerning your eligibility for employment on AEC work is as follows. And then we have an interjection. Let the record show at this point that Mr. Garrison asked to be excused for a few minutes. I'm guessing he went to the bathroom or something, but bam, he's out. He's out of the room now. That's fun. Okay. Back to the letter. It was reported that in 1940 you were listed as a sponsor of the Friends of the Chinese People, an organization which was characterized in 1944 by the House Committee on Un-American Activities as a Communist Front organization. It was further reported that in 1940 your name was included on a letterhead of the American Committee for Democratic and Intellectual Freedom as a member of its National Executive Committee. The American Committee for Democracy and Intellectual Freedom was characterized in 1942 by the House Un-American Activities Committee as a communist front which defended communist teachers, and in 1943 it was characterized as subversive and un-American by a special subcommittee of the House Committee on Appropriations. It was further reported that in 1938 you were a member of the Western Council of the Consumers Union. The Consumers Union was cited in 1944 by I'm going to call them the HWAC, for brevity, the House Un-American Activities Committee, as a communist front headed by the communist Arthur Callett. It was further reported that you stated in 1943 that you were not a communist, but had probably belonged to every communist front organization on the West Coast, and had signed many petitions in which communists were interested. So what this reminds me of is a lot of the stuff that I learned about the Red Scare and Joe McCarthy, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and this was when I was reading the play The Crucible by Arthur Miller, which is about the Salem witch trials, but he wrote it and published it at a time where all of this paranoia was going around about communism, and he was obviously trying to make the comparison. So yeah, that's just what this reminds me of immediately. Okay. It was reported that in 1943 and previously you were intimately associated with Dr. Jean Tatlock, a member of the Communist Party in San Francisco, and that Dr. Tatlock was partially responsible for your association with Communist Front groups. So, okay, spoiler warning, okay? Spoilers. Dr. Tatlock, that is played by Florence Pugh, and Oppenheimer has an affair with her. So yes, very scandalous. Um, okay. It was reported that your wife, Catherine Puning Oppenheimer, was formerly the wife of Joseph Dalit, a member of the Communist Party who was killed in Spain in 1937 fighting for the Spanish Republican Army. It was further reported that during the period of her association with Joseph Dalit, your wife became a member of the Communist Party. The Communist Party has been designated by the Attorney General as a subversive organization which seeks to alter the form of government of the United States by unconstitutional means, within the purview of Executive Order 9835 and Executive Order 10450. So here we mention Oppenheimer's wife, Catherine Oppenheimer, and this is her. Okay. It was reported that your brother, Frank Friedman Oppenheimer, became a member of the Communist Party in 1936 and has served as a party organizer and as educational director of the professional section of the Communist Party in LA County. It was further reported that your brother's wife, Jackie Oppenheimer, was a member of the Communist Party in 1938, and that in August 1944, Jackie Oppenheimer assisted in the organization of the East Bay branch of the California Labor School. It was further reported that in 1945, Frank and Jackie Oppenheimer were invited to an informal reception at the Russian consulate, that this invitation was extended by the American-Russian Institute of San Francisco, and was for the purpose of introducing famous American scientists to Russian scientists, who were delegates to the United Nations Conference on International Organization being held at San Francisco at that time, and that Frank Oppenheimer accepted this invitation. It was further reported that Frank Oppenheimer agreed to give a 6 weeks course on the social implications of modern scientific development at the California Labor School, beginning May 9, 1946. The American-Russian Institute of San Francisco and the California Labor School have been cited by the Attorney General as communist organizations within the purview of Executive Order 9835 and Executive Order 10450. It was reported that you have associated with members and officials of the Communist Party, including Isaac Folkoff, Steve Nelson, Rudy Lambert, Kenneth May, Jack Manley, and Thomas Addis. It was reported that you were a subscriber to the Daily People's World, a West Coast communist newspaper in 1941 and 42. It was reported in 1950 that you stated to an agent of the FBI that you had in the past made contributions to Communist Front organizations, although at the time you did not know of Communist Party control or extent of infiltration of these groups. You further stated to an agent of the FBI that some of these contributions were made through Isaac Folkoff, whom you knew to be a leading Communist Party functionary, because you had been told that this was the most effective and direct way of helping these groups. It was reported that you attended a housewarming party at the home of Kenneth and Ruth May on September 20th, 1941, for which there was an admission charge for the benefit of the People's World, and that at this party you were in the company of Joseph W. Weinberg and Clarence Hiskey, who were alleged to be members of the Communist Party and to have engaged in espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union. It was further reported that you informed officials of the U.S. Department of Justice in 1952 that you had no recollection that you had attended such a party, but that since it would have been in character for you to have attended such a party, you would not deny that you were there. It was reported that you attended a closed meeting of the professional section of the Communist Party of Alameda County, California, which was held in the latter part of July or early August 1941 at your residence, 10 Kenilworth Court, Berkeley, California, for the purpose of hearing an explanation of a change in Communist Party policy. It was reported that you denied that you attended such a meeting and that such a meeting was held in your home. It was reported that you stated to an agent of the FBI in 1950 that you attended a meeting in 1940 or 1941, which may have taken place at the home of Hakan Chevalier. Oh, okay. That's a name from the movie. He's in the movie. I didn't make a slide for him though, but I imagine this stream will not be comprehensive. I imagine I'm gonna have to split it into multiple parts because there are 20 or 19 of these volumes. So. But yes, he's a character in the movie, Hakan Chevalier, which was addressed. Okay, I'll start over. It was reported that you stated to an agent of the FBI in 1950 that you attended a meeting in 1940 or 41, which may have taken place at the home of Hakan Chevalier, which was addressed by William Schneiderman, whom you knew to be a leading functionary of the Communist Party. In testimony in 1950 before the California State Senate Committee on Un-American Activities, Hakan Chevalier was identified as a member of the Communist Party in the San Francisco area in the early 1940s. Let the record show that Mr. Garrison has returned to the hearing room. Very cool. Bam, he's back. It was reported that you have consistently denied that you have ever been a member of the Communist Party. It was further reported that you stated to a representative of the FBI in 1946 that you had a change of mind regarding the policies and politics of the Soviet Union about the time of the signing of the Soviet-German Pact in 1939. It was further reported that during 1950 you stated to a representative of the FBI of the FBI. They say Federal Bureau of Investigation every single time, and I'm trying to just say FBI, but then my eyes see the full thing again, and I get confused. Okay. Of the FBI, that you had never attended a closed meeting of the Communist Party, and that at the time of the Russo-Finnish War and the subsequent break between Germany and Russia in 1941, you realized the Communist Party infiltration tactics into the alleged anti-fascist groups and became fed up with the whole thing and lost what little interest you had. So yeah, so this is actually a very interesting point that people forget a lot, is that at the start of World War II, when Germany invaded Poland, the Soviet Union also invaded Poland, and Hitler and Stalin had made an agreement to not attack each other at their new border in the middle of Poland. And this really surprised a lot of people because, such as Oppenheimer, because traditionally people think communism is the opposite of fascism, that communists and fascists are complete enemies and they can't work together. It would be ridiculous. Yet the Communist Party the Communist Russia had just signed a pact with fascist Nazi Germany. And for someone like Oppenheimer, who is ethnically Jewish, he was not happy about that at all. And it was a very contentious issue in around this time when Germany and Russia were on the same side. A lot of the communist newspapers that they mentioned in the US didn't know how to respond because they're like, we don't want to criticize the Soviet Union because it's like our big, communist country that we want to defend. You know how people get tribalist, but they were literally siding with the Nazis. So a lot of these newspapers remained very tactically neutral, and Oppenheimer did not like that because he was very anti-fascism. He sent money to the they mentioned it earlier, the Spanish Republican Army, which was one of the two sides in the Spanish Civil War. They're kind of like socialist. I don't know the full history there, but what I do know is that the other side was fascist, and so Oppenheimer was supporting the Republican Army because he was against the fascists in Spain. And so it's the same thing here. He broke with the Communist Party in America because of their like tacit approval almost of Germany. Not really tacit approval, but tacit approval of Russia's dealings with Germany. Now, ultimately, this became moot because in 42, Hitler ended up invading Russia anyway, and so pact broken, pacts off. And pretty much right on cue, the communist newspapers in the US were right back on track with criticizing Nazi Germany again. But it is weird because you have this like 2-3 year period where these newspapers that are communist and therefore one would think anti-fascist are defending Nazi Germany, which is not a place that you want to be in. So a lot of people were very upset with this, and Oppenheimer, from the sounds of it, was one of them. Okay, but continuing with the letter. It was further reported, however, that A. Prior to April 1942, you had contributed $150 per month to the Communist Party in the San Francisco area, and that the last such payment was apparently made in April 1942, immediately before your entry into the atomic bomb project. B. During the period 1942 to 45, various officials of the Communist Party, including Dr. Hannah Peters, organizer of the professional section of the Communist Party, Alameda County, California; Bernadette Doyle, secretary of the Alameda County Communist Party; Steve Nelson, David Adelson, Paul Pinsky, Jack Manley, and Katrina Sandow, are reported to have made statements indicating that you were then a member of the Communist Party, that you could not be active in the party at the time, that your name should be removed from the party mailing list and not mentioned in any way, that you had talked the atomic bomb question over with the party members during this period, and that several years prior to 1945, you had told Steve Nelson that the Army was working on an atomic bomb. C. You stated in August of 1943 that you did not want anybody working for you on the project who was a member of the Communist Party, since one always had a question of divided loyalty, and the discipline of the Communist Party was very severe and not compatible with complete loyalty to the project. You further stated at that time that you were referring only to present membership in the Communist Party, and not to people who had been members of the party. You stated further that you knew several individuals then at Los Alamos who had been members of the Communist Party. You did not, however, identify such former members of the Communist Party to the appropriate authorities. It was also reported that during the period 42 to 45, you were responsible for the employment on the atom bomb project of individuals who were members of the Communist Party or closely associated with activities of the Communist Party, including Giovanni Lassi Lominitz, Joseph W. Weinberg, David Bohm, Max Bernard Friedman, and David Hawkins. In the case of Giovanni Rossi Lominitz, you urged him to work on the project, although you stated that you knew he had been very much of a Red when he first came to the University of California, and that you emphasized to him that he must forego all political activity if he came to the project. In August 1943, you protested against the termination of his deferment and requested that he be returned to the project after his entry into the military service. It was reported that you stated to representatives of the FBI on September 5, 1946, that you had attended a meeting in the East Bay and a meeting in San Francisco at which there were present persons definitely identified with the Communist Party. When asked the purpose of the East Bay meeting and the identity of those in attendance, you declined to answer on the ground that this had no bearing on the matter of interest being discussed. It was reported that you attended a meeting at the home of Frank Oppenheimer on January 1, 1946, with David Adelson and Paul Pinsky, both of whom were members of the Communist Party. It was further reported that you analyzed some material which Pinsky hoped to take up with the Legislative Convention in Sacramento, California. It was reported in 1946 that you were listed as vice chairman on the letterhead of the Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions, Incorporated, which has been cited as a communist front by the HUAC. It was reported that prior to March 1, 1943, possibly 3 months prior to Peter. Sorry. It was reported that prior to March 1st, 1943, possibly 3 months prior, Peter Ivanov, secretary of the Soviet consulate, San Francisco, approached George Charles Eltington for the purpose of obtaining information regarding work being done at the radiation laboratory for the use of Soviet scientists. That George Charles Eltington subsequently requested Hakon Chevalier to approach you concerning this matter. That Hakon Chevalier thereupon approached you either directly or through your brother, Frank Friedman Oppenheimer, in connection with this matter, and that Hakon Chevalier finally advised George Charles Eltington that there was no chance whatsoever of obtaining the information. It was further reported that you did not report this episode to the appropriate authorities until several months after its occurrence, that when you initially discussed this matter with the appropriate authorities on August 26, 1943, you did not identify yourself as the person who had been approached, and you refused to identify Chevalier as the individual who made the approach on behalf of Eltington, and that it was not until several months later, when you were ordered by a superior to do so, that you identified Chevalier. It was further reported that upon your return to Berkeley following your suspension from the Los Alamos project, you were visited by the Chevaliers on several occasions, and that your wife was in contact with Hakon and Barbara Chevalier in 1946 and 47. So this is a major plot point in the movie. They have the guy playing Chevalier, I forget who it is, approach Oppenheimer and in like a very subtle way, say like, some people are saying that we should, share this with the Russians since they're our allies in the war. And, maybe I just wanted to let you know that, there are channels outside the blah blah blah. Like he doesn't directly say it, but that's what this is referring to. Because then he doesn't want to report his friend directly and get him in trouble. So, but he still wants to make the proper report. So that is a big thing of conflict, and ultimately it has come back to get him in trouble. Okay. It was reported that in 1945 you expressed the view that there is a reasonable possibility that the hydrogen bomb, can be made, but that the feasibility of the hydrogen bomb did not appear on theoretical grounds as certain as the fission bomb appeared certain on theoretical grounds when the Los Alamos laboratory was started, and that in the autumn of 1949 the General Advisory Committee expressed the view that an imaginative and concerted attack on the problem has a better than even chance of producing the weapon within 5 years. It was further reported that in the autumn of 1949, I'm getting winded, and subsequently, you strongly opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, 1, on moral grounds, 2, by claiming that it was not feasible, and 3, by claiming that there were insufficient facilities and scientific personnel to carry on the development, and 4, that it was not politically desirable. It was further reported that even after it was determined as a matter of national policy to proceed with development of a hydrogen bomb, you continued to oppose the project and declined to cooperate fully on the project. It was further reported that you departed from your proper role as an advisor to the Commission by causing the distribution, separately and in private, to top personnel at Los Alamos, of the majority and minority reports of the General Advisory Committee on Development of the Hydrogen Bomb for the purpose of trying to turn such top personnel against the development of the hydrogen bomb. It was further reported that you were instrumental in persuading other outstanding scientists not to work on the hydrogen bomb project, and that the opposition to the hydrogen bomb, of which you are the most experienced, most powerful, and most effective member, has definitely slowed down its development. So yeah, as I was saying, I mean, could you imagine if they had built a hydrogen bomb during World War II and had used it? I mean, that would have been devastating. Hydrogen bombs have been detonated, but only in tests. So There has never been a hydrogen bomb dropped on a city. And that is what people think of classically when not classically. Uh, when people think of like nuclear Armageddon, they're talking about hydrogen bombs, like Terminator, stuff like that. Uh, because something really fascinating is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are cities today. People live there. Like, it's not still destroyed, it has been rebuilt. Like, that would not be possible if you had a hydrogen bomb dropped on you. If you had an atomic bomb, clearly we've seen that people can recover from that. But a hydrogen bomb is just on a whole nother level. And so Oppenheimer recognized this and was like, let's not do that. Anyway, in view of your access to highly sensitive classified information, and in view of these allegations, which, until disproved, raise questions as to your veracity, conduct, and even your loyalty, the commission has veracity. There's a lot of typos because you're typing fast, typists. Okay. And in view of these allegations, which until disproved raise questions as to your veracity, conduct, and even your loyalty, the Commission has no other recourse in discharge of its obligations to protect the common defense and security, but to suspend your clearance until the matter has been resolved. Accordingly, your employment on the AEC work and your eligibility for access to restricted data are hereby suspended, effective immediately, pending final determination of this matter. To assist in the resolution of this matter, you have the privilege of appearing before an AEC Personnel Security Board. To avail yourself of the privileges afforded you under the AEC hearing procedures, you must, within 30 days following receipt of this letter, submit to me in writing your reply to the information outlined above and request the opportunity of appearing before the Personnel Security Board. Should you signify your desire to appear before the board, you will be notified of the composition of the board and may challenge any member of it for cause. Such challenge should be submitted within 72 hours of the receipt of notice of composition of the board. And that's the meeting we're at now, his challenge, right? If no challenge is raised as to the members of the board, you will be notified of the date and place of hearing at least 48 hours in advance of the date set for hearing. You may be present for the duration of the hearing, may be represented by counsel of your own choosing, and present evidence in your own behalf through witnesses or by documents or by both. Should you elect to have a hearing of your case by the Personnel Security Board, the findings of the board, together with its recommendations regarding your eligibility for employment on AEC work in the light of criteria for determining eligibility for AEC security clearance and the requirements of Executive Order 10450, will be submitted to me. Me being Nichols. In the event of an adverse decision in your case by the Personnel Security Board, you will have an opportunity to review the record made during your appearance before the board and to request a review of your case by the Commission's Personnel Security Review Board. If a written response is not received from you within 30 days, it will be assumed that you do not wish to submit any explanation for further consideration. In that event, or should you not advise me in writing of your desire to appear before the Personnel Security Board, a determination in your case will be made by me on the basis of the existing record. I am enclosing herewith, for your information and guidance, copies of the criteria and procedures for determining eligibility for AEC security clearance and Executive Order 10450. This letter has been marked confidential to maintain the privacy of this matter between you and the AEC. And now it's unconfidential and we're reading it. How fun. You are not precluded from making use of this letter as you may consider appropriate. I have instructed Mr. William Mitchell, whose address is 1901 Constitution Avenue, Washington, D.C., and whose telephone number is sterling 38000 extension 277, to give you whatever further detailed information you may desire with respect to the procedures to be followed in this matter. Very truly yours, K.D. Nichols, General Manager. 2 enclosures, 1 criteria and procedures. 2 enclosures, 1 criteria and procedures, 2 Executive Order 10450. And now we are no longer quoting Nichols. And remember, this is Gray talking this whole time. I think at this time, then, it would be appropriate for the record to reflect Dr. Oppenheimer's reply on March 4th, 1954. I shall now read Dr. Oppenheimer's reply. So let's pull up Oppenheimer. But remember, Gray is quoting here, so. Okay. This is a letter addressed to Major General K.D. Nichols, General Manager, U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, Washington, 25, D.C. Dear General Nichols, this is in answer to your letter of December 23, 1953, in which the question is raised whether my continued employment as a consultant on AEC work will endanger the common defense and security, and whether such continued employment is clearly consistent with the interests of the national security. Though of course I would have no desire to retain an advisory position if my advice were not needed, I cannot ignore the question you have raised, nor accept the suggestion that I am unfit for public service. The items of so-called derogatory information set forth in your letter cannot be fairly understood except in the context of my life and my work. This answer is in the form of a summary account of relevant aspects of my life in more or less chronological order, in the course of which I shall comment on the specific items in your letter. Through this answer and through the hearings before the Personnel Security Board, which I hereby request, I hope to provide a fair basis upon which the questions posed by your letter may be resolved. The pre-war period. I was born in New York in 1904. My father had come to this country at the age of 17 from Germany. He was a successful businessman and quite active in community affairs. My mother was born in Baltimore, and before her marriage was an artist and teacher of art. I attended Ethical Culture School and Harvard College, which I entered in 1922. I completed the work for my degree in the spring of 1925. I then left Harvard to study at Cambridge University and in Göttingen, where in the spring of 1927 I took my doctor's degree. The following year, I was National Research Fellow at Harvard and at the California Institute of Technology. In the following year, I was Fellow of the International Education Board at the University of Leiden and at the Technical High School in Zurich. In the spring of 1929, I returned to the United States. I was homesick for this country, and in fact, I did not leave it again for over 19 years. I had learned a great deal in my student days about the new physics. The new physics is quantum mechanics. I wanted to pursue this myself, to explain it, and to foster its cultivation. I had had many invitations to university positions, 1 or 2 in Europe, and perhaps 10 in the United States. I accepted concurrent appointments as assistant professor at Caltech in Pasadena and at the University of California in Berkeley. For the coming 12 years, I was to devote my time to these 2 facilities. Starting with a single graduate student in my first year in Berkeley, we gradually began to build up what was to become the largest school in the country of graduate and postdoctoral study in theoretical physics, so that as time went on, we came to have between 12 and 20 people learning and adding to quantum theory, nuclear physics, relativity, and other modern physics. As the number of students increased, so in general did their quality. The men who worked with me during those years hold chairs in many of the great centers of physics in this country. They have made important contributions to science and, in many cases, to the atomic energy project. Many of my students would accompany me to Pasadena in the spring after the Berkeley term was over, so that we might continue to work together. My friends both in Pasadena and in Berkeley were mostly faculty people, scientists, classicists, and artists. I studied and read Sanskrit with Arthur Ryder. I read very widely, but mostly classics, novels, plays, and poetry, and I read something of other parts of science. I was not interested in and did not read about economics or politics. I was almost wholly divorced from the contemporary scene in this country. I never read a newspaper or a current magazine like Time or Harper's. I had no radio, no telephone. I learned of the stock market crash in the fall of 1929 only long after the event. The first time I ever voted was in the presidential election of 1936. To many of my friends, my indifference to contemporary affairs seemed bizarre, and they often chided me with being too much of a highbrow. I was interested in man and his experience. I was deeply interested in my science, but I had no understanding of the relations of man to his society. I spent some weeks each summer with my brother Frank at our ranch in New Mexico. There was a strong bond of affection between us. After my mother's death, my father came often, mostly in Berkeley, to visit me, and we had an intimate and close association until his death. Beginning in late 1936, my interests began to change. These changes did not alter my earlier friendships, my relations to my students, or my devotion to physics, but they added something new. I can discern in retrospect more than one reason for these changes. I had had a continuing, smoldering fury about the treatment of Jews in Germany. I had relatives there, and was later to help in extricating them and bringing them to this country. I saw what the Depression was doing to my students. Often they could get no jobs, or jobs which were wholly inadequate. And through them I began to understand how deeply political and economic events could affect men's lives. I began to feel the need to participate more fully in the life of the community, but I had no framework of political conviction or experience to give me perspective in these matters. In the spring of 1936, I had been introduced by friends to Jean Tatlock, the daughter of a noted professor of English at the university, and in the autumn I began to court her, and we grew close to each other. We were at least twice close enough to marriage to think of ourselves as engaged. Between 1939 and her death in 1944, I saw her very rarely. She told me about her Communist Party memberships, they were on-again, off-again affairs, and never seemed to provide for her what she was seeking. I do not believe that her interests were really political. She loved this country and its people and its life. She was, as it turned out, a friend of many fellow travelers and communists, with a number of whom I was later to become acquainted. I should not give the impression that it was wholly because of Jean Tatlock that I made left-wing friends, or felt sympathy for causes which hitherto would have seemed so remote from me, like the Loyalist cause in Spain and the organization of migratory workers. I have mentioned some of the other contributing causes. I liked the new sense of companionship, and at the time felt that I was coming to be part of the life of my time and country. In 1937, my father died. A little later, when I came into an inheritance, I made a will leaving this to the University of California for fellowships to graduate students. This was the era of what the communists then called the United Front, in which they joined with many non-communist groups in support of humanitarian objectives. That is very important. There was like a very broad net, and so that's kind of why Oppenheimer got entangled. So yeah. Many of these objectives engaged my interest. I contributed to the strike fund of one of the major strikes of Bridges Union. I subscribed to the People's World. I contributed to the various committees and organizations which were intended to help the Spanish Loyalist cause. I was invited to help establish the Teachers Union, which included faculty and teaching assistants at the university and school teachers of the East Bay. I was elected recording secretary. My connection with the Teachers Union continued until sometime in 1941, when we disbanded our chapter. During these same years, I also began to take part in the management of the physics department, the selection of courses, and the awarding of fellowships, and in the general affairs of the graduate school of the university, mostly through the Graduate Council, of which I was a member for some years. I also became involved in other organizations. For perhaps a year, I was a member of the Western Council of the Consumers Union, which was concerned with evaluating information on products of interest on the West Coast. I do not recall Arthur Callett, the national head of the Consumers Union. At most, I could have met him if he made a visit to the West Coast. I joined the American Committee for Democracy and Intellectual Freedom. I think it then stood as a protest against what had happened to intellectuals and professionals in Germany. I listed in the Personnel Security Questionnaire that I filled out in 1942 for employment with the Manhattan District the very few political organizations of which I had ever been a member. I say on that questionnaire that I did not include sponsorships. I have no recollection of the Friends of the Chinese People or of what, if any, my connection with this organization was. The statement is attributed to me that, while I was not a communist, I had probably belonged to every Communist Front organization on the West Coast and had signed many petitions in which communists were interested. I do not recall this statement, nor to whom I might have made it, nor the circumstances. The quotation is not true. It seems clear to me that if I said anything along the lines quoted, it was a half-jocular overstatement. The matter which most engaged my sympathies and interests was the war in Spain. This was not a matter of understanding, and this, sorry, this was not a matter of understanding and informed convictions. I had never been to Spain. I knew a little of its literature. I knew nothing of its history or politics or contemporary problems. But like a great many other Americans, I was emotionally committed to the Loyalist cause. I contributed to various organizations for Spanish relief. I went to and helped with many parties, bazaars, and the like. Even when the war in Spain was manifestly lost, these activities continued. The end of the war and the defeat of the Loyalists caused me great sorrow. It was probably through Spanish relief efforts that I met Dr. Thomas Addis and Rudy Lambert. As to the latter, our association never became close. As to the former, he was a distinguished medical scientist who became a friend. Addis asked me, perhaps in the winter of 1937 to 38, to contribute through him to the Spanish cause. He made it clear that this money, unlike that which went to the relief organizations, would go straight to the fighting effort, and that it would go through communist channels. I did so contribute. Usually when he communicated with me, explaining the nature of the need, I gave him sums in cash, probably never much less than $100, and occasionally perhaps somewhat more than that, several times during the winter. I made no such contributions during the spring terms when I was in Pasadena or during the summers in New Mexico. Later, but I do not remember the date, Addis introduced me to Isaac Fokoff, who was, as Addis indicated, in some way connected with the Communist Party, and told me that Fokoff would from then on get in touch with me when there was need for money. This he did in much the same way that Addis had done before. As before, these contributions were for specific purposes, principally the Spanish War and Spanish relief. Sometimes I was asked for money for other purposes, the organization of migratory labor in the California valleys, for instance. I doubt that it occurred to me that the contributions might be directed to other purposes than those I had intended, or that such other purposes might be evil. I did not then regard communists as dangerous, and some of their declared objectives seemed to me desirable. In time, these contributions came to an end. I went to a big Spanish relief party the night before Pearl Harbor, and the next day, as we heard the news of the outbreak of war, I decided that I had had about enough of the Spanish cause and that there were other more pressing crises in the world. My contributions would not have continued much longer. My brother Frank married in 1936. Our relations thereafter were inevitably less intimate than before. He told me at the time, probably in 1937, that he and his wife Jackie had joined the Communist Party. Over the years, we saw one another as occasions arose. We still spent summer holidays together. In 1939 or 40, Frank and Jackie moved to Stanford. In the autumn of 1941, they came to Berkeley, and Frank worked for the radiation laboratory. At the time, he made it clear to me that he was no longer a member of the Communist Party. As to the alleged activities of Jackie and Frank in 1944, 45, and 46, I was not in Berkeley in 1944 and 45. I was away most of the first half of 1946. I do not know whether these activities occurred or not, and if I had any knowledge of them at the time, it would have been very sketchy. That's funny. I didn't know sketchy was that old a term. It would have been very sketchy. After Christmas of 1945, my family and I visited my brother's family for a few days during the holidays, and I remember that we were there New Year's Eve and New Year's Day in 1946. On New Year's Day, people were constantly dropping in. Pinsky and Adelson, who were at most casual acquaintances of mine, may have been among them, but I cannot remember their being there. nor indeed do I remember any of the others who dropped in that day, or what was discussed. It was in the summer of 1939 in Pasadena that I met my wife. She was married to Dr. Harrison, who was a friend and associate of the Tolmans. Lauritsen's, Tolmans, Lauritsens, and others of the Caltech faculty. I learned of her earlier marriage to Joe Dallet and of his death fighting in Spain. He had been a Communist Party official, and for a year or two during their brief marriage my wife was a Communist Party member. When I met her, I found in her a deep loyalty to her former husband, a complete disengagement from any political activity, and a certain disappointment and contempt that the Communist Party was not in fact what she had once thought it was. My own views were also evolving. Although Sidney and Beatrice Webb's book on Russia, which I had read in 1936, and the talk that I heard at that time had predisposed me to make much of the economic progress and general level of welfare in Russia, and little of its political tyranny, my views on this were to change. I read about the Purge trials, though not in full detail, and could never find a view of them which was not damning to the Soviet system. In 1938, I met three physicists who had actually lived in Russia in the 30s. All were eminent scientists: Platchik, Weisskopf, and Schein. Schein. And the first two have become close friends. What they reported seemed to me so solid, so unfanatical, so true that it made a great impression, and it presented Russia, even when seen from their limited experience, as a land of purge and terror, of ludicrously bad management, and of a long-suffering people. I need to make clear that this changing opinion of Russia, which was to be reinforced by the Nazi-Soviet pact and the behavior of the Soviet Union in Poland and in Finland, did not mean a sharp break for me with those who held to different views. At the time, I did not fully understand, as in time I came to understand, how completely the Communist Party in this country was under the control of Russia. During and after the Battle of France, however, and during the Battle of England the next autumn, I found myself increasingly out of sympathy with the policy of disengagement and neutrality that the Communist press advocated. After our marriage in 1940, my wife and I, for about 2 years, had much the same circle of friends as I had had before, mostly physicists and university people. Among them, the Chevaliers in particular showed us many acts of kindness. We were occasionally invited to more or less obviously left-wing affairs, Spanish relief parties that still continued, and on two occasions, once in San Francisco and once in Berkeley, we attended social gatherings of apparently well-to-do people at which Schneiderman, an official of the Communist Party in California, attempted, not with success as far as we were concerned, to explain what the communist line was all about. I was asked about the Berkeley meeting in an interview in 1946 with agents of the FBI. I did not then recall this meeting, and in particular did not in any way connect it with Chevalier, about whom the agents were questioning me. Hence it seemed wholly irrelevant to the matter under discussion. Later, my wife reminded me that the Berkeley meeting had occurred at the house of the Chevaliers, and when I was asked about it by the FBI in 1950, I told them so. We saw a little of Kenneth May. We both liked him. It would have been not unnatural for us to go to a housewarming for May and his wife. Neither my wife nor I remember such a party. Weinberg was known to me as a graduate student. Hiskey I did not know. Steve Nelson came a few times with his family to visit. He had befriended my wife in Paris at the time of her husband's death in Spain in 1937. Neither of us has seen him since 1941 or 42. Because of these associations that I have described and the contributions mentioned earlier, I might well have appeared at the time as quite close to the Communist Party, perhaps even to some people as belonging to it. As I have said, some of its declared objectives seemed to me desirable, but I never was a member of the Communist Party. I never accepted communist dogma or theory. In fact, it never made sense to me. I had no clearly formulated political views. I hated tyranny and repression and every form of dictatorial control of thought. In most cases, I did not in those days know who was and who was not a member of the Communist Party. No one ever asked me to join the Communist Party. Your letter sets forth statements made in 1942 to 45 by persons said to be Communist Party officials to the effect that I was a concealed member of the Communist Party. I have no knowledge as to what these people might have said. What I do know is that I was never a member of the party, concealed or open. Even the names of some of the people mentioned are strange to me, such as Jack Manley and Katrina Sandow. I doubt that I met Bernadette Doyle, although I recognize her name. Pinsky and Adelson I met at most casually, as previously mentioned. By the time that we moved to Los Alamos in early 1943, both as a result of my changed views and of the great pressure of war work, my participation in left-wing organizations and my associations with left-wing circles had ceased and were never to be re-established. Home we had of our own. We settled down to live in it with our new baby. We had a good many friends, but little leisure. My wife was working in biology. There's no Y, the typist missed it. My wife was working in biology at the university. Many of the men I had known went off to work on radar and other aspects of military research. I was not without envy of them, but it was not until my first connection with the rudimentary atomic energy enterprise that I began to see any way in which I could be of direct use. Let the record here we go. Let the record show that Mr. Oppenheimer has asked to be excused briefly. So, he's going to the bathroom or something. Boop. Okay. Back to the letter. The war years. Ever since the discovery of nuclear fission, the possibility of powerful explosives based on it had been very much in my mind, as it had in that of many other physicists. We had some understanding of what this might do for us in the war, and how much it might change the course of history. In the autumn of 1941, a special committee was set up by the National Academy of Sciences, under the chairmanship of Arthur Compton, to review the prospects and feasibility of the different uses of atomic energy for military purposes. I attended a meeting of this committee. This was my first official connection with the atomic energy program. After the Academy meeting, I spent some time in preliminary calculations about the construction and performance of atomic bombs, and became increasingly excited at the prospects. At the same time, I still had... Here, wait, I want to see... There's noises out there. Oh my gosh. There's so much construction around me. I gotta see if you guys can hear that. So let me just check that for a second. Oh my god. Yeah, you can totally hear that. Okay. Well, there's nothing I can do about it. I'm gonna take a few more sips of water though. Yeah, it's not thunder, it's construction or something. I'm pretty sure. Let me see what the weather app says. Oh, it is thundering. Okay, that is thunder. Okay. Oh, that's funny. Crazy weather recently. Yeah, look at this. I'm gonna cover this. Look at that. It's all red. I love when that weather app does this. It turns all red. It's like the Death Star or something. Like it's freaky. Anyway, yeah, I think this is all very interesting, interesting stuff. Reading this letter that Oppenheimer wrote. Because yeah, a lot of this stuff that was like, wow, it's really bad out there. A lot of this stuff is in the movie, and so I find it really interesting how much of it made it in there. I imagine that the biographers that first wrote the book American Prometheus, they probably read this. They probably read through the whole thing. Wow. I'll try and talk about other things for a little while. We'll take a little break from the transcript so that the audio isn't like damaged, permanently on the watchback. But yeah, no, this is very interesting. So I bet the biographers read it, and like they interviewed Cillian Murphy, and he said that he read the biographer's book, American Prometheus. So, you know, and that a lot of people on set of Oppenheimer had. So it's interesting. A lot of this stuff got into the movie um, through like this sort of secondhand kind of thing. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to chat. Maybe I can answer them before my house gets blown down by the thunderstorm. Okay, I am just going to soldier on. Uh, I will try to speak more loudly. Okay. After the Academy meeting, I spent some time in preliminary calculations about the construction and performance of atomic bombs, and became increasingly excited at the prospects. At the same time, I still had a quite heavy burden of academic work with courses and graduate students. I also began to consult, more or less regularly, with the staff of the radiation lab in Berkeley on their program for the electromagnetic separation of uranium isotopes. I was never a member or employee of the laboratory, but I attended many of its staff and policy meetings. With the help of two of my graduate students, I developed an invention which was embodied in the production plants at Oak Ridge. I attended the conference in Chicago at which the metallurgical laboratory to produce plutonium was established and its initial program projected. In the spring of 1942, Compton called me to Chicago to discuss the state of work on the bomb itself. During this meeting, Compton asked me to take the responsibility for this work, which at that time consisted of numerous scattered experimental projects. Although I had no administrative experience and was not an experimental physicist, I felt sufficiently informed and challenged by the problem to be glad to accept. At this time, I became an employee at the metallurgical laboratory. After this conference, I called together a theoretical study group in Berkeley in which Betha, Konopinsk, Serber, Teller, Van Vleck, and I participated. We had an adventurous time. We spent much of the summer of 1942 in Berkeley in a joint study that for the first time really came to grips with the physical problems of atomic bombs, atomic explosions, and the possibility of using fission explosions to initiate thermonuclear reactions. I called this possibility to the attention of Dr. Bush during the late summer. The technical views on this subject were to develop and change from then until the present day. After these studies, there was little doubt that a potentially world-shattering undertaking lay ahead. We began to see the great explosion at Alamogordo and the greater explosions at Eniwetok with a surer foreknowledge. We also began to see how rough, difficult, challenging, and unpredictable this job might turn out to be. When I entered the employ of the metallurgical laboratory, I filled out my first personnel security questionnaire. Let the record show that Dr. Oppenheimer has returned to the hearing room. Bam. If my power actually goes out, the stream's over, guys. I hate to say. Okay. Later in the summer, I had word from Compton that there was a question of my clearance on the ground that I had belonged to left-wing political groups, but it was indicated that this would not prove a bar to my further work on the program. In later summer, after a review of the experimental work, I became convinced, as did others, that a major change was called for in the work on the bomb itself. We needed a central laboratory devoted wholly to this purpose, where people could talk freely with each other, where theoretical ideas and experimental findings could affect each other, where the waste and frustration and error of the many compartmentalized experimental studies could be eliminated, where we could begin to come to grips with chemical, metallurgical, engineering, and ordnance problems that had so far received no consideration. We therefore sought to establish this laboratory. I'm getting a call. One moment. That was my roommate letting me know that a whole block down the street just lost power. So I really don't want this stream to end. I'm having so much fun. Uh, so yeah. Anyway. Okay. We therefore sought to establish this laboratory for a direct attack on all the problems inherent in the most rapid possible development and production of atomic bombs. In the autumn of 1942, General Groves assumed charge of the Manhattan Engineer District. I discussed with him the need for an atomic bomb laboratory. There had been some thought of making this laboratory a part of Oak Ridge. For a time, there was support for making it a military establishment in which key personnel would be commissioned as officers, and in preparation for this course, I once went to the Presidio. I don't know what that is. Presidio to take the initial steps toward obtaining a commission. After a good deal of discussion with the personnel who would be needed at Los Alamos and with General Groves and his advisors, it was decided that the laboratory should, at least initially, be a civilian establishment in a military post. While this consideration was going on, I had showed General Groves Los Alamos, and he almost immediately took steps to acquire the site. In early 1943, I received a letter signed by General Groves and Dr. Conant, appointing me director of the laboratory, and outlining their conception of how it was to be organized and administered. The necessary construction and assembling of the needed facilities were begun. All of us worked in close collaboration with the engineers of the Manhattan District. The site of Los Alamos was selected in part at least because it enabled those responsible to balance the obvious need for security with the equally important need of free communication among those engaged in the work. Security, it was hoped, would be achieved by removing the laboratory to a remote area, fenced and patrolled, where communication with the outside was extremely limited. Telephone calls were monitored. Mail was censored. Telephone calls were monitored. Mail was censored, and personnel who left the area, something permitted only for the clearest of causes, knew that their movements might be under surveillance. On the other hand, for those within the community, fullest exposition and discussion among those competent to use the information was encouraged. All right, we have our first chat from Mateus Mateus de Bem. That's interesting. So yeah, I think it's really interesting too how like this is like a little mini memoir right here from Oppenheimer. This letter in response to Nichols. I mean, you could see in the first half he was definitely responding to every like accusation that Nichols had made, and now he's talking about his work during the Manhattan Project, which is obviously just very interesting. I mean, that's the whole draw of the movie, isn't it? Right. Um, the personal stuff is a little more incidental, but yeah. The last months of 1942 and early 1943 had hardly hours enough to get Los Alamos established. The real problem had to do with getting to Los Alamos the men who would make a success of the undertaking. For this we needed to understand as clearly as we then could what our technical program would be, what men we would need, what facilities, what organizations, what plan. The program of recruitment was massive. Even though we then underestimated the ultimate size of the laboratory, which was to have almost 4,000 members by the spring of 1945, and even though we did not at that time see clearly some of the difficulties which were to bedevil and threaten the enterprise, we knew that it was a big, complex, and diverse job. Even the initial plan of the laboratory called for a start with more than 100 highly qualified and trained scientists, to say nothing of the technicians, staff, and mechanics who would be required for their support, and of the equipment that we would have to beg and borrow since there would be no time to build it from scratch. We had to recruit we had to recruit at a time when the country was fully engaged in war and almost every competent scientist was already involved in the military effort. The primary burden of this fell on me. To recruit staff, I traveled all over the country talking with people who had been working on one or another aspect of the atomic energy enterprise, and people in radar work, for example, and underwater sound, telling them about the job, the place that we were going to, and enlisting their enthusiasm. In order to bring responsible scientists to Los Alamos, I had to rely on their sense of the interest, urgency, and reasonability, maybe feasibility, of the Los Alamos mission. I had to tell them enough of what the job was and give strong enough assurance that it might be successfully accomplished in time to affect the outcome of the war, to make it clear that they were justified in their leaving other work to come to this job. The prospect of coming to Los Alamos aroused great misgivings. It was to be a military post. Men were asked to sign up more or less for the duration. Restrictions on travel and on the freedom of families to move about were to be severe, and no one could be sure of the extent to which the necessary technical freedom of action could actually be maintained by the laboratory. The notion of disappearing into the New Mexico desert for an indeterminate period and under quasi-military auspices disturbed a good many scientists and the family of many more. But there was another side to it. Almost everyone realized that this was a great undertaking. Almost everyone knew that if it were completed successfully and rapidly enough, it might determine the outcome of the war. Almost everyone knew that it was an unparalleled opportunity to bring to bear the basic knowledge and art of science for the benefit of this country. Almost everyone knew that this job, if it were achieved, would be a part of history. This sense of excitement, of devotion, and of patriotism in the end prevailed. Most of those with whom I talked came to Los Alamos. Once they came, confidence in the enterprise grew as men learned more of the technical status of the work, and though the laboratory was to double and redouble its size many times before the end, once it had started, it was on the road to success. We had information in those days of German activity in the field of nuclear fission. We were aware of what it might mean if they beat us to the draw in the development of atomic bombs. The consensus of all our opinions and every directive that I had stressed the extreme urgency of our work, as well as the need for guarding all knowledge of it from our enemies. Past communist connections or sympathies did not necessarily disqualify a man from employment if we had confidence in his integrity and dependability as a man. There are two items of derogatory information on which I need to comment at this point. The first is that it was reported that I had talked the atomic bomb question over with Communist Party members during this period, 1942 to 45. The second is that I was responsible for the employment of the atomic bomb project of individuals who were members of the Communist Party or closely associated with activities of the Communist Party. As to the first, my only discussions of matters connected with the atomic bomb were for official work or for recruiting the staff of the enterprise. So far as I knew, none of these discussions were with Communist Party members. I never discussed anything of my secret work or anything about the atomic bomb with Steve Nelson. As to the statement that I secured the employment of doubtful persons on the project, of those mentioned, Lominitz, Friedman, and Weinberg were never employed at Los Alamos. I believe that I had nothing to do with the employment of Friedman and Weinberg by the radiation laboratory. I had no responsibility for the hiring of anyone there. During the time that I continued to serve as a consultant with the radiation laboratory and to advise and direct the work of some of the graduate students, I assigned David Bohm and Chaim Richman to a problem of basic science which might prove useful in analyzing experiments in connection with fast neutrons. That work has long been published. Another graduate student was Rosie Lominitz. I remember vaguely a conversation with him in which he expressed reluctance to take part in defense research, and I encouraged him to do what other scientists were doing for their country. Thereafter, he did work at the radiation laboratory. I remember no details of our talk. If I asked him to work on the project, I would have assumed that he would be checked by the security officers as a matter of course. Later, in 1943, when Lominitz was inducted into the Army, he wrote me asking me to help his return to the project. I forwarded a copy of this letter to the Manhattan District security officers and let the matter rest there. Still later, at Lominitz's request, I wrote to his commanding officer that he was qualified for advanced technical work in the Army. Let's see. Okay. I asked for the transfer of David Bohm to Los Alamos, but this request, like all others, was subject to the assumption that the usual security requirements would apply. And when I was told that there was an objection on security grounds to this transfer, I was much surprised, but of course agreed. David Hawkins was known to the personnel director at the laboratory, and I had met and liked him and found him intelligent. I supported the suggestion of the personnel director that he come to Los Alamos. I understand that he had had left-wing associations, but it was not until in March of 1951, at the time of his testimony, that I knew about his membership in the Communist Party. In 1943, when I was alleged to have stated that I knew several individuals then at Los Alamos who had been members of the Communist Party, I knew of only one. She was my wife, of whose disassociation from the party and of whose integrity and loyalty to the United States I had no question. Later, in 1944 or 45, my brother Frank, who had been cleared for work in Berkeley and at Oak Ridge, came to Los Alamos from Oak Ridge with official approval. I knew of no attempt to obtain secret information at Los Alamos. Prior to my going there, my friend Haakon Chevalier with his wife visited us on Eagle Hill, probably in early 1943. During the visit, he came into the kitchen and told me that George Ententon had spoken to him of the possibility of transmitting technical information to Soviet scientists. I made some strong remark to the effect that this sounded terribly wrong to me. The discussion ended there. Nothing in our long-standing friendship would have led me to believe that Chevalier was actually seeking information. I think that line's literally in the movie. Quote, "Nothing in our long-standing friendship would have led me to believe that Chevalier was actually seeking information." And I was certain that he had no idea of the work on which I was engaged. It has long been clear to me that I should have reported the incident at once. The events that led me to report it, which I doubt ever would have become known without my report, were unconnected with it. During the summer of 1943, Colonel Lansdale, the intelligence office of the Manhattan District, came to Los Alamos and told me that he was worried about the security situation in Berkeley because of the activities of the Federation of Architects, Engineers, Chemists, and Technicians. This recalled to my mind that Eltonton was a member and probably a promoter of the FACT. Shortly thereafter, I was in Berkeley, and I told the security officer that Eltonton would bear watching. When asked why, I said that Eltonton had attempted through intermediates to approach people on the project, though I mentioned neither myself nor Chevalier. Later, when General Groves urged me to give the details, I told him of my conversation with Chevalier. I still think of Chevalier as a friend. The story of Los Alamos is long and complex. Part of it is public history. For me, it was a time so filled with work, with the need for decision and action and consultation, that there was room for little else. I lived with my family in the community which was Los Alamos. It was a remarkable community, inspired by a high sense of mission, of duty, and of destiny, coherent, dedicated, and remarkably selfless. There was plenty in the life of Los Alamos to cause irritation: the security restrictions, many of my own devising, the inadequacies and inevitable fumblings of a military post, unlike any that had ever existed before, shortages, inequities, and in the laboratory itself, the shifting emphasis on different aspects of the technical work as the program moved forward. But I have never known a group more understanding and more devoted to a common purpose, more willing to lay aside personal convenience and prestige, more understanding of the role that they were playing in their country's history. Time and again, we had in the technical work almost paralyzing crises. Time and again, the laboratory drew itself together and faced the new problems and got on with the work. We worked by night and by day, and in the end, the many jobs were done. These years of hard and loyal work of the scientists culminated in the test on July 16, 1945. It was a success. I believe that in the eyes of the War Department and other knowledgeable people, it was as early a success as they had thought possible, given all the circumstances, and rather a great one. There were many indications from the Secretary of War and General Groves, and many others, that official opinion was one of satisfaction with what had been accomplished. At the time, it was hard for us in Los Alamos not to share that satisfaction, and hard for me not to accept the conclusion that I had managed the enterprise well and played a key part in its success. But it needs to be stated that many others contributed the decisive ideas and carried out the work which led to this success, and that my role was that of understanding, encouraging, suggesting, and deciding. It was the very opposite of a one-man show. Even before the July 16th test and the use of the bombs in Japan, the members of the laboratory began to have a new sense of the possible import of what was going on. In the early days, when success was less certain and timing unsure, and the war with Germany and Japan in a desperate phase, it was enough for us to think that we had a job to do. Now, with Germany defeated, the war in the Pacific approaching a crisis, and the success of our understanding almost assured, there was a sense both of hope and of anxiety as to what this spectacular development might portend for the future. This came to us a little earlier than to the public generally because we saw the technical development at close range and in secret, but its quality was very much the same as the public response after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thus, it was natural that in the spring of 1945, I welcomed the opportunity when I was asked by Secretary Stimson to serve, along with Compton, Lawrence, and Fermi, on an advisory panel to his interim committee on atomic energy. We met with that committee on the 1st of June 1945. And even during the week when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were being bombed, we met at Los Alamos to sketch out a prospectus of what the technical future in atomic energy might look like. Atomic warheads for guided missiles, improvements in bomb designs, the thermonuclear program, power, propulsion, and the new tools available from atomic technology for research in science, medicine, and technology. This work absorbed much of my time during September and October, and in connection with it, I was asked to consult with the War and State Departments on atomic energy legislation, and in a preliminary way, on the international control of atomic energy. I resigned as director of Los Alamos on October 16, 1945, after having secured the consent of Commander Bradbury and General Groves that Bradbury should act as my successor. There were then on the books at the laboratory, embodied in memoranda and reports that summarized by me in letters to General Groves, developments in atomic weapons which could well have occupied years for their fulfillment, and which have in fact provided some, though by no means all, of the themes for Los Alamos work since that. Here, wait. I keep getting. 1 second. Okay. It was not entirely clear whether the future. Oh, wait. Did I? Man, I'm getting tired. Okay. I'll start this paragraph over. There were then on the books at the laboratory, embodied in memoranda and reports and summarized by me in letters to General Groves, developments in atomic weapons which could well have occupied years for their fulfillment, and which have in fact provided some, though by no means all, of the themes for Los Alamos work since that time. It was not entirely clear whether the future of atomic weapons work in this country should be continued at or confined to Los Alamos, or started elsewhere at a more accessible and more practical site, or indeed what effect international agreements might have on the program. But in the meantime, Los Alamos had to be kept going until there was created an authority competent to decide the question of its future. This was to take almost a year. The post-war period. In November 1945, I resumed my teaching at Caltech, with an intention and hope never realized that this should be a full-time undertaking. The consultation about post-war matters, which had already begun, continued, and I was asked over and over, both by the executive and the Congress, for advice on atomic energy. I had a feeling of deep responsibility, interest, and concern for many of the problems with which the development of atomic energy confronted our country. This development was to be a major factor in the history of the evolving and mounting conflict between the free world and the Soviet Union. When I and other scientists were called on for advice, our principal duty was to make our technical experience and judgment available. We were called to do this in a context and against a background of the official views of the government on the military and political situation of our country. Immediately after the war, I was deeply involved in the effort to devise effective means for the international control of atomic weapons, means which might, in the words of those days, tend toward the elimination of war itself. As the prospects of success receded, and as evidence of Soviet hostility and growing military power accumulated, we had more and more to devote ourselves to finding ways of adapting our atomic potential to offset the Soviet threat. In the period marked by the first Soviet atomic explosions, the war in Korea and the Chinese Communist intervention there, we were principally preoccupied, though we never forgot long-term problems, with immediate measures which could rapidly build up the strength of the United States under the threat of an imminent general war. As our own atomic potential increased and developed, we were aware of the dangers inherent in comparable developments by the enemy, and preventative and defensive measures were very much on our minds. Throughout this time, the role of atomic weapons was to be central. From the close of the war, when I returned to the West Coast, until finally in the spring of 1947, when I went to Princeton as the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, I was able to spend very little time at home and in teaching in California. In October 1945, at the request of Secretary of War Patterson, I had testified before the the House Committee on Military Affairs in support of the May-Johnson bill, which I endorsed as an interim means of bringing about without delay the much-needed transition from the wartime administration of the Manhattan District to post-war management of the atomic energy enterprise. In December 1945 and later, I appeared at Senator McMahon's request in sessions of his Special Committee on Atomic Energy, which was considering legislation on the same subject. Under the chairmanship of Dr. Richard Tolman, I served on a committee set up by General Groves to consider classification policy on matters of atomic energy. For 2 months, early in 1946, I worked steadily as a member of a panel, the Board of Consultants to the Secretary of State's Committee on Atomic Energy, which, with the Secretary of State's Committee, prepared the so-called Acheson-Lilienthal report. After the publication of this report, I spoke publicly in support of it. A little later, when Mr. Baruch was appointed to represent the United States in the United Nations Atomic Energy Committee, I became one of the scientific consultants to Mr. Baruch and his staff in preparation for and in the conduct of our efforts to gain support for the United States plan. I continued as consultant to General Osborne when he took over the effort. Okay. At the end of 1946, I was appointed by the President as a member of the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission. At its first meeting, I was elected chairman and was re-elected until the expiration of my term in 1952. This was my principal assignment during these years as far as the atomic energy program was concerned, and my principal preoccupation apart from academic work. A little later, I was appointed to the Committee on Atomic Energy of the Research and Development Board, which was to advise the military establishment about the technical aspects of the atomic energy program. I served on it for 7 years and twice was designated chairman of special panels set up by the committee. Meanwhile, I had become widely regarded as a principal author or inventor of the atomic bomb, more widely, I well knew, than the facts warranted. In a modest way, I had become a kind of public persona. I was deluged, as I have been ever since, with requests to lecture and to take part in numerous scientific activities and public affairs. Most of these I did not accept. Some important for the promotion of science or learning or of public policies that corresponded to my convictions I did accept. The Council of the National Academy of Sciences, the Committee on the Present Danger, the Board of Overseers of Harvard College, and a good number of others. A quite different and, I believe, unique occurrence is cited as an item of derogatory information, that in 1946 I was listed as vice chairman on the letterhead of the Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions Incorporated, cited as a communist front by the HWAC. The fact is that, in 1946, when I was at work on the international control of atomic energy, I was notified that I had been nominated and then elected as vice chairman of this organization. When I began to see that its literature included slogans such as "Withdraw United States Troop from China," and that it was endorsing the criticism enunciated by the then Secretary Nolan of the United States policy on atomic energy, I advised the organization in a letter of October 11, 1946, that I was not in accord with its policy, that I regarded the recommendations of Mr. Wallace, not Wallane, typo, Mr. Wallace, as not likely to advance the cause of finding a satisfactory solution for the control of atomic energy, and that I wished to resign. When an effort was made to dissuade me from this course, I again wrote on December 2, 1946, insisting upon resignation. Later in the post-war period, an incident occurred which seems to be the basis of one of the items of derogatory information. In May 1950, Paul Crouch, a former communist official, and Mrs. Crouch testified before the California State Committee on Un-American Activities that in July 1941 they had attended a Communist Party meeting at a house in Berkeley, of which I was then the tenant. On the basis of pictures and movies of me, which they saw some 8 years later, they said they recognized me as having been present. When the FBI first talked to me about this alleged incident, I was quite certain that no such meeting as Crouch described had occurred. So was my wife, when I discussed it with her. Later, when I saw the testimony, I became even more certain. Crouch had described the gathering as a closed meeting of the Communist Party. I was never a member of the party. Crouch said that no introductions had been made. I would not recall ever having had a group of people at my home that had not been introduced. In May of 1952, I again discussed this alleged meeting with the U.S. Attorney in the Weinberg case, an indictment against Joseph Weinberg for perjury for having, among other things, denied membership in the Communist Party. I again said that I could not have been present at a closed meeting of the Communist Party because I was not a member of the party, that I had searched my memory and that the only thing that conceivably could be relevant was the vaguest impressions that someone on the campus might at some time have asked permission to use our home for a gathering of young people. That, however, I could recall no such gathering nor any meeting even remotely resembling the one described by Crouch, that I thought it probable that at the time of the meeting, which by then had been fixed by Crouch as approximately July 23rd, my wife and I were away from Berkeley. Shortly thereafter, with the aid of counsel, we were able to establish that my wife and I left Berkeley within a few days after July 4th, 1941,